Hi, I'm Leonard Marcus, and I'm here this afternoon because I've written a book about Madeleine L'Engle called Listening for Madeleine, which will be published this fall. And I thought I would read you a little bit from it. In making this book, I recorded the memories of a great many people who knew Madeleine L'Engle, some very well, others not so well, but all of whom had memorable experiences with her. And I thought for today, since this is the kind of gathering that she would have loved to be at herself, it would be interesting to hear someone else's memory of her speaking on another occasion, somewhat like this. The person you'll be hearing from is a writer named Sidney Offutt, who was a young sports writer when these events took place in the early 1960s. Just a couple of years after Madeleine had won the Newbery for A Wrinkle in Time. Sidney thought a lot of himself, and he is a very funny storyteller. He was a little worried for this companion, this other author who he had been sent out on tour with. As you'll hear, he need not have worried about her. I first met Madeleine when we were touring together as fellow authors. She and I and a handful of other writers would travel from city to city in the Northeast and Midwest, speaking to large groups of children, librarians, and parents. I hate to be immodest about it, but what frequently happened at these speaking events is that the distinguished writers would draw the crowd, and then I would get up and tell the stories that wowed the kids. I had learned early on that when speaking to children, you had to be dramatic. So I would do voices for them and really ham it up, and I would always get a good response. I mention this because the first time I was on a program with Madeleine at a huge gathering somewhere in Ohio, I noticed that the schedule called for me to speak first and for Madeleine to go second. I knew that Madeleine had written A Wrinkle in Time, but I'd never met her before. And I knew that some of the best writers who went out on these tours were deadly dull as speakers. It might sound cocky, but I honestly thought the response of the young audiences to me when I spoke was so strong that it simply was not fair to let me go first and then have somebody else go afterward. So I took the librarian in charge of the event aside, explained the situation to him, and said, "Out of fairness to Madeleine L'Engle, why don't you let me speak? Why don't you let her speak before me?" "Have you ever heard her speak?" he said. "No," I said, suddenly concerned that he might have taken my suggestion the wrong way. "I'm not being critical, you understand. She seems like a very fine lady. I'm just doing this to protect her." He looked at me squarely and said, "I can tell that you've never heard her speak. Don't worry about Madeleine L'Engle." We went ahead with the program as planned. I got up and gave my talk. To say that it went over well would be a major understatement. Thunderous applause, kids leaping out of their seats all over this giant auditorium. It was rock star stuff. Everyone wanted to get close to me. In other words, it all went exactly as I had said it would. Next would be Madeleine's turn, and once again I thought, poor lady. Well, at least I tried. So now Madeleine walks out on stage. She is a tall woman, but on stage she looks even taller. She is carrying a big bag, not a paper bag, but more like a carry-all. She tosses her head back with a regal flourish and looks directly at the audience. She hasn't said a word yet, but suddenly the auditorium turns absolutely still. She has us all in the palm of her hand. I'm sitting there at the edge of my seat thinking, this is incredible. What is she going to do next? She opens the bag and she pulls something out of it. Something, as I recall, which looked a little bit like a dead rabbit. It isn't a dead rabbit. It may have just been an ordinary piece of cloth. Now a look of surprise crosses her face as she says, "What could this be? And I wonder what else is in this bag." She pulls something else out, and she does this again and again. And as she does so, she begins to improvise a story involving each of the objects from her magical Scheherazade bag. I realized that what Madeleine is really doing is showing the audience the essential nature of storytelling. The fact that one can make a story from absolutely anything. It is a riveting performance, and from then on, Madeleine and I were always good friends. So. I would just add to that not only did Madeleine hold strongly to the belief that a story can be made from anything, but she also believed that everyone had their own story to tell. So when you go home this evening, there's something good to think about. Thank you very much.
Meg knew all at once that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which must be near, because all through her she felt a flooding of joy and of love that was even greater and deeper than the joy and love which were already there. She stopped laughing and listened, and Charles listened too. Hush. Then there was a whirring, and Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which were standing in front of them, and the joy and love were so tangible that Meg felt that if she only knew where to reach, she could touch it with her bare hands. Mrs. Whatsit said breathlessly, "Oh, my darlings, I'm sorry we don't have time to say goodbye to you properly. You see, we have to." But they never learned what it was that Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which had to do, for there was a gust of wind, and they were gone.
I didn't write the book to teach anybody anything. I wrote it to tell a good story, and a good story always teaches something, but not if you plan to. It has to happen.